To lesson 1 of the Blockchain Fundamentals course on BenLearn. In this lesson, we will cover the basics of money and explain its history. Before introducing Bitcoin and blockchain and understanding really how it works, it's important to gain an understanding of what money is and how it has evolved over time. Today, we will discuss the history of money, starting with the beginnings of money and the mental ledger. We'll work through the barter system and the different evolutions of hard currencies. And lastly, we'll cover modern money and introduce the concept of digital currencies. So you might be wondering, what is the actual definition of money? Money is defined as anything that is used as a means of exchange. If I'm giving you a t-shirt of mine, for example, in exchange for some plywood, both of these items are considered money in the transaction. In our earlier example, we talked about plywood being exchanged for a piece of clothing. Now, do you really think that either of these items have good properties of money? Obviously, they are not good examples of what money should be. Good sources of money share a few key properties listed on the slide. The first one is that it can act as a store of value. Store of value essentially means that a form of money can always, 1, hold its value, 2, doesn't lose its value in certain conditions, and 3, is generally portable and storable. In our transaction, plywood is not really a good example of this. It eventually decomposes and it even goes bad if it rains, meaning that it wouldn't really be a good store of value. Next is acting as a good medium of exchange. This refers to the general acceptability of a certain currency. Now, plywood wouldn't really satisfy this property because not everyone wants plywood. I would even go as far as to say most people wouldn't even know what to do with it. And lastly, good sources of money have a unit of account. This just means that it's easily divisible and can be broken up into smaller pieces. Today's dollar is a great example of a unit of account. Dollars can be broken down into various quantities, even down to a single cent. A t-shirt of plywood, though, doesn't really have that same capability. You either take that t-shirt as a whole or not at all. So now that we've covered the basics of money, let's talk about the earliest iterations of money. Before the rise of the barter economy, people still found ways to exchange goods. In early times of civilization, people used things like mental ledgers to keep track of who owes what. Now, for example, if someone collected some vegetables and distributed it to their neighbors, they would keep an account of who owes what. The system of keeping a mental or recorded ledger was the first way that human beings transacted. Obviously, a mental ledger could only last for so long before society needed something more. Thus came about the barter system like we talked about earlier. Things like grain, livestock, and precious jewels all served as quote-unquote currencies in the barter system. But like we talked about earlier, there are many shortcomings to the barter system because it doesn't abide by the properties of money. Eventually, the first currency was established using metallic coins. These coins were a standardized token that represented value to everyone. Gold came about as the first major global currency. Now, why do you think gold was such a good fit to do this? Exactly what it says on the screen. It satisfies the different properties of money. It's scarce and it's a good store of value, meaning it's rare and holds its value over time. It's accepted by everyone, pretty easy to transport, and doesn't lose value over time and under certain conditions. This made gold a very valuable commodity and popular currency for much of history. Even today, you might be able to go around and gold might be an acceptable form of payment at some places. Money has gone through various iterations. After the era of gold and metallic coins, many nations began to introduce paper money that represented national currencies. National currencies replaced the global gold currency system because it allowed for a few different things to happen. It created tradable currencies in a marketplace, allowed for countries to develop their own economies, and gave rise to central banks as a way to manage currencies. It's important to note here that most currencies were actually pegged to gold for value. This means that each note distributed by the government was backed up by actual gold in that value held by the government. Now, fast forward a little bit. In the post-World War II era, the US emerged as the world's foremost financial superpower. In a time of wild fluctuations in foreign currencies, many countries began pegging their currencies to the US dollar, establishing the dollar as the world's reserve currency. The dollar itself was pegged to gold during this time. This entire system became known as the Bretton Woods system, after the town in New Hampshire where the UN established this system. Now, this Bretton Woods system helped Europe rebuild itself in the aftermath of World War II, and it worked well until the US economy began to falter. As a battle against many different economic crises in the 70s, the US printed more money than it had in gold reserves, essentially defeating the purpose of the gold standard. This move caused massive inflation in the US dollar, and in turn, currencies around the world felt its effect too. This chain of events caused a massive exodus from the Bretton Woods system and led to the establishment of independent fiat currencies. These currencies were no longer pegged to gold reserves and are simply set by central banks and governments. It holds value as long as the general public accepts it and the government gives it value. Fiat currencies give central banks the ability to raise and lower interest rates, print money, and even act as a central nervous system for their respective currencies. Obviously, this is the current system we have today, and it's worked really well during times of economic expansion and not so well during recessions such as the 2008 subprime mortgage crisis. Now, fiat money is backed by two different promises, right? And these promises are very important in keeping its legitimacy. The first is that the US government will take reasonable action to preserve the US dollar's purchasing power. And the second is that the US government will only accept taxes in the form of USD. These two promises give the money its value and will keep it that way so long the general public accepts it. This serves as a nice segue to the latest form of money, and that's digital money. And no, I'm not talking about money in your online checking account. That's just an electronic form of paper money made by banks. Digital currencies are digitally native money. There is no physical counterpart. Digital currencies have been around since the 90s during the advent of the internet. The first major example is actually not Bitcoin. It was called DigiCash, founded by David Chaum, and was launched in the 1990s. Closely resembling digital currencies of today, it didn't pan out because of lack of infrastructure and adoption back then. There was no Amazon or eBay and PayPal for online transactions to be a thing, and e-commerce wasn't as popular as it is today. This set the stage for a new cryptocurrency called Bitcoin, published under the pseudonym Satoshi Nakamoto. This new digital currency will be far more influential than its previous predecessor. Our next lesson, What is Bitcoin?, will introduce you to the currency and how it works. Thank you very much.